has experienced loss in my life, I think it's important that we at least begin to put words and allow ourselves to talk about things that we may be feeling, because I think the way towards recovery and clarity about difficult things is to actually talk about them. And since this is a topic that I am consistently dealing with on a day-to-day basis, it makes us way more alike than we are different. And so I'll just introduce myself. My name is Deborah Jackson, and I am the executive director and founder of Heal 3D, which is our organization really focused on progressing caregiver health and expanding Alzheimer's education within the community. And also my ministry, Heart to Soul Ministries, which is purely ministry and focused on healing, wholeness, and bringing hope to people through Jesus Christ. And so we'll talk more about Heart to Soul Ministries in the future, but for the most part, I just really felt led today to begin having a conversation about grief, because not only are we faced with it on every side of us right now during this pandemic, but as a caregiver, I know that it is probably at the root of just about every conversation that I am having with caregivers of all types, but especially even with caregivers that are dealing with dementia. I don't think I can see comments that are coming in on my Facebook log because I'm on my computer. But for those of you on Facebook, please forgive me. I'm new at both Instagram and Facebook together. And so if I don't see your comments right now, I'll work on that so that I have another device going where I can see your comments in the future. So Facebook Live, forgive me. Instagram, I see you. But just be patient with me. The next time we do this, I will definitely try and get a device where I can see comments on Facebook. But I was sharing with you that in my ministry, one of the things that we are going to be focused on are really trying to not necessarily solve the problem, but really delve into issues that are very almost just kind of not really dealt with, that I think in the long run may hold people back, because the way we deal with things is to talk about them. And so grief is one of those areas that I know that we will be focused on. It's an area that I know God has moved in my life over long periods of time. And I feel like while I am still going through it as a dementia caregiver, I can also allow my ministry and my own grief work to the benefit of other people while I'm also ministering to myself. And happy Sunday to you too. And so just to kind of lay the groundwork, we won't be able to have a full dialogue about grief, but I really do think that this is a good way to begin the conversation about grief and to maybe talk about some things that will offer clarity and perspective about grief when it comes to Christ and how he lived and various different people within the Bible. I think sometimes we expect the Bible to speak in very specific word terms in order for us to be able to apply it to our lives, but it doesn't always do that. But the Bible is filled with comfort and assurance all through the book of Psalms about grief, and it's also filled with context about how people have responded to grief, which gives us an assurance about how we too can respond to grief as best we can when we go through it. And it certainly makes us know that the feelings that we have about grieving and when we're in the throes of grieving are normal, and that these seasons, when we're in them, we have people in the Bible that we can draw upon their experiences to know also how they moved through it and how God moved in their lives, so that we can expect how God can also move in our lives when we are going through grief. And so in this chat, I want to kind of touch on 3 areas and then kind of drill down on each of those 3 a little bit. And I will qualify and say I don't yet have my licensure in counseling. However, I do and have spent 5 years in seminary doing a lot of work in pastoral care and counseling, and just graduated with my Master's of Divinity. So while I am not certainly offering any kind of therapeutic advice for people, I just want to give you some level of assurance and comfort of my background for many of you that don't know me yet or are getting to know me. I hope to also, by way of my own experience, be able to share things that will be helpful and hopeful to anyone going through this journey. So I want to talk about 3 areas. One is the pain of grief that we often experience in the way of sorry, I keep getting a pause on my Instagram. But the other is anticipatory grief, which is extremely common for people that have or are going through the loss of someone that maybe has cancer. In the case of Alzheimer's or dementia, we know from experience that anticipatory grief, even though you might not have had a name for it, is a real thing. And oftentimes in a lot of my studies, my research, my own experiences, anticipatory grief is as real as any other grief. And a lot of dementia type caregivers, people that are going through the valley of the shadow of death because someone they love may be terminal or dying of some other disease, have experienced, anticipatory grief. So I want to talk a little bit about anticipatory grief, but I also want to draw parallels that will help you scripturally. And then I want to just end on how grief is really, oftentimes maybe you've heard of grief being like this linear staged process, and you go through denial and you go through this and you go through that. Well, in a lot of my studies, I have come to adopt a more trajectory approach to grief because I believe that the Bible bears it out. I believe that the studies bear it out, that grief is more of a trajectory, a pathway that we experience, and it's quite messy and it's muddy and it's raw. And it's one of the reasons why no one really talks about it, because no one really knows how to talk about it in many cases unless they've dealt with it or been through it. But it's more of a pathway to recovering and moving through it as opposed to a linear process that you go through these stages. And so I just kind of want to end talking about that and then providing examples too to show how this is what happened also in the scriptures. So just to start with a little story about losses, which is the first area that I want to talk about, the pain of loss. As a dementia caregiver, for those of you that may not know my story, I've been a dementia caregiver to my mom for about 9 years. Today was actually particularly a difficult day because I woke up to find my mom was not sleeping, but needless to say, I won't get into that story right now, but it was a difficult morning. And so this journey for the last 9 years has been really fraught with ups and downs and highs and lows and disappointments and losses. And it's very different than when I lost my dad, which was almost 30 years ago. I was in my 20s and I got knocks at the door with people close to me telling me that my dad had died in the church pulpit. And so that was shock, and that changed me and my mom. And then this journey with dementia is different because we've been on it since my mom was 80. My mom just turned 90 on April 20th. And so one of the stories I'll share is it's a short story about loss, and loss specifically related to this journey I'm on right now. But any kind of pain that we experience where there is a loss then leads to grief, right? And so I share that because I think we need to understand, my dog is barking in the back, any kind of pain that we experience can lead to grief, Gracie. Sorry. And that pain that we experience that can lead to grief is something that we really have to deal with, okay? And so this particular time that I was in, my mom, who, you know, was vibrant. You know, my mom was independent. When I came here, my mom was doing things on her own, even though we know that there was a problem with the dementia that was kind of brewing in her life. And one of the things that my mom used to do as a routine was she would drink her coffee in the morning. And so after being here a couple of years and things began to progress slowly in her short-term memory, I recognized one morning that my mom wasn't coming into the kitchen, fixing her coffee and doing her routine. And as part of that, after a period of time, I realized that this was going to be like one of the first losses that I experienced, and it was painful to me. As small as it is, I realized that my mom was no longer going to be able to do this thing that she had done her whole life, which was get up, go in the kitchen, make her coffee, and go back to her room and read the newspaper. And as small as it was, I remember the moment that it happened and the moment that I realized that this wasn't just like a one-time thing, that this was going to be a loss of something that she would never actually do again. Something that simple, like going into the kitchen and making her coffee and putting the coffee filter in the coffee maker and all of that was something that was actually a death. And with dementia, we experience these kinds of deaths every single day, if not every day, very often. And so losses take place on a regular basis. Now that makes it unique from when I lost my dad, because when I lost my dad, it was so sudden and unexpected. It was an immediate shock. And so you have to go through the period of shock. And then the aftershock, you end up getting into a place where you are now able to move through a grieving, trajectory. And so that particular loss really took me back with my mom, because it wasn't something that just happened one time. It was something that I would realize that my mom would never do again. And these are the kinds of things that we deal with when you're dealing with the loss, like a painful loss of capacity, or you have a loss of some experience that you had that you know that you'll never have again. And so anytime there's a painful loss, we experience grief. And so I share that as a point of understanding that there's some grief, there are different types of grief that we experience. And in this particular case, this is a continual stage of grieving, especially for the person that's going through dementia or some form of dementia where short-term memory loss and cognition is part of it. And so I share that as a realization that when you go through something like that, it also affects your perspective on time and moments. And so you begin, while you're going through this grieving process, you also begin to have a different view of time. And so then we hit moments like we're in right now with COVID, and so many more than 100,000 people, 160 or 70,000 people have lost someone that they love, and they didn't expect to lose the person they love. They didn't expect to lose them that way. And so in the middle of this loss, there's this shock and this grief that people are now going through over what they thought would be that isn't. And so now you're really grieving the loss of what you had in mind. And so here we are in the middle of all of this, with people having to deal with the grief of and loss of what they had in mind. And so I never had in mind, I never thought for one second that I would be taking care of my mom. My mom would lose capacity to do certain things. And in doing those certain things, there would be certain things that I thought that we would do that we would not, or things that I thought were ahead of us that are now aren't. And that is extremely painful. Anticipatory grief is another one that I want to talk about, like I said, because it deals so much with the anticipation of what is to come, but this tension that exists between what is it that is what is going to happen, meaning the death of the person at some point, and this tension between the burden or the responsibility or the pain of what is going on right now. And in my case, it would be the actual disease of Alzheimer's or dementia. And so, hi, everybody. I don't know everyone's real names, but wave to me, say hi. I see you there on Instagram. Anticipatory grief is constantly also dealing with this tension between what is going on in the actual circumstance and in my case the disease of Alzheimer's, and there's a burden there. There are difficulties that are physiological difficulties and emotional difficulties going on in that situation, and you want them to be over, but then there's this tension with not wanting the person to be gone. And so it's not confusing, but it's conflicting, and we have to be able to deal with those emotions. So what are the types of losses that we experience? We experience loss from moments. We experience loss of time. We experience loss of health, capacity. We experience loss of money, loss of dreams, loss of a career. And one of the things that I've seen in all of my losses is that God really is working in the midst of all of these losses. But sometimes we just need some guidance, not necessarily at the time that we're grieving, because our perspective and our clarity really comes best in hindsight. Grief is not something that can be buffered. It's not something that we can be insulated from. At some point, everyone in this world will experience grief. That's right. I know that it's true, but I think oftentimes many of us don't realize or have not tapped into, or maybe don't have it, an empathy and a compassion for people that are going through grief, because it's separate from us. And so I even believe that within the church, we need to even consider, kind of increasing our capacity to really be able to focus on how do we minister to people grieving in various different ways, so that people can get the kind of support and insulated help that they need to move through processes in a healthy way. So an example I gave you of loss was the example of the coffee pot with my mom. That was a small loss, but it had a big impact on me. Another example, and this is more trauma, but it still was a loss associated with it, was Hurricane Katrina. And for many of you that may not be from the New Orleans area, this area experienced a tremendous trauma and losses of people that were devastating and are still devastating to people's lives and families and towns. Some people never really came back together again. Some people did, but some people didn't. And these are losses that people experience that play a role in how they have grieved, how they see grief moving forward, how they have dealt with grief to be able to move on in a healthy way. And so those are types of losses that I've experienced. I actually left a career, and even though it was by choice, it was a loss affiliated with it. It was a very difficult move. It was a difficult walking away from something. And so then you have to go through the grieving process. I think, quite frankly, that many people may be experiencing difficulties emotionally in their lives today because of things that they haven't properly grieved or gone through from the past. And so, again, this just speaks to why I think grief is so incredibly important, or dealing with grief is so important. I welcome any of you to make comments or to share, ask me any questions as we go along. I'm paying close attention. I definitely want to be able to answer any questions that anyone has as I'm kind of going through this. I don't want it to be a one-sided dialogue, but I hope even this one will lead to dialogues that we can have that are more two-way, where I'm hearing from you and I'm able to share and we're able to kind of bounce off one another as well.